Given the fertile intellectual atmosphere of your childhood, could you tell us when was your first research experience?
Well, I guess you'd say when I was in 9th grade and my dad was counting radio listeners, and he'd bring home yellow pads and show me how to count 1, 2, 3, 4 cross, 1, 2, 3, 4 cross.
Oh, when you were 9?
I was about 9, fourth grade, something like that, yeah.
And when did you realize that you had an interest in politics and government?
Well, I guess in high school I was class of 38, and that was 2 years after the Literary Digest was knocked out by Gallup, Roper, and Crossley. And I did a little paper, I remember, went and interviewed Hadley Cantrell and some other people. So I guess that was when I started getting an interest in public opinion generally.
And didn't you do some work for the paper in Radcliffe? At Radcliffe?
Oh, I went on to Radcliffe, and I majored in government, and I wrote a senior thesis on public opinion, and I was poll editor for the Radcliffe News. So I was into it by then, yes.
And what was your first job right after Radcliffe?
Well, I was class of 42, which was the post-Pearl Harbor class. So I went down to Washington, spent the war, and first working for Office of War Information, OWI, that turned into U.S. Information Agency later, where I spent quite a lot of my career. But I worked for OWI for just a few months, and then it went into food requirements and shortages and population shifts and so forth. Spent the whole war in Washington.
How about at some point in between, didn't you work for Crossley Inc. just for a little while?
Well, after the war, I went to New York and spent 2 years at my dad's company, Crossley Inc., doing tabulating radio listeners again, and then working on some of the public opinion surveys. I remember working on a Wisconsin study for Governor Dewey.
Could you tell us something about your experience with NORC?
Well, that's after I had my internship, whatever you want to call it. I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, and the NORC, National Opinion Research Center, had been founded at the University of Denver, and then it had just moved to Chicago, leaving behind a regional ORC, of which Don Gahalan was director, and they set up some fellowships, and I applied for the fellowship, and I got one. So I spent 2 years at DU, ending up with my master's and a year as instructor at the university. So that's my basic academic experience and my initial connection with NORC.
Right, and from NORC you moved on, that's when you moved on to doing the work for USIA?
No, I went to Washington again for a short tour with some people who later became presidents of AAPOR, Jack Ellenson, Reuben Cohen, and also Ira Sisson, in the little office that was left over from Sam Stauffer's group that wrote the 4 volumes of The American Soldier. And then I went from there to a 3-year tour in Germany. This was the remainder of the research branch that had been so active during the war. So I spent 3 years in Germany, ending up heading what was left of the little research branch.
Sure, and could you tell us about what types of studies you were conducting in Germany?
Well, this was with the military, and we were doing surveys of the military personnel, asking things like why they would or would not re-enlist, why they preferred to sign on for Korea, which had become a pretty desperate war by then, rather than stay in Germany. And the reason, of course, being that they had something like 7 or 8 months in Korea as opposed to 2 or 3 years in Germany. So we found out some things like that. We also did studies on their attitudes towards the German population, which is where I came in contact with Leo Crespi, who was running the well-known surveys, the HICOG, High Commissioner of Germany, was still during our occupation. And that's how I got into AAPOR, where I was quite active for quite a while.
But let's just staying on Europe, because that's fascinating. What was it like conducting international research at that time?
Well, I wasn't really doing international research until I got into USIA later on. I was working with U.S. personnel, and mostly self-administered surveys, which were an interesting type of research to do.
Okay, and were there any particular challenges of being a woman doing research at that time in Germany? No?
Well, yes, I think in the military situation, when I got to be branch chief, I was looked at as a bit of a curiosity, but there were no obstacles in my way, really.
And around, I think we had a previous discussion, you said around 1960 or so, you were a research officer for AID programs in Korea?
Well, we're jumping around.
Sure.
Because after my stint in Germany, I went back to NORC for a while. Then I signed on with the USIA in 1955. By that time, Leo Crespi had come home from running the HICOG surveys in Germany and had set up the research office for USIA. And then he instituted international studies, and we would do simultaneous studies. It doesn't seem like much nowadays, but we always had the big four: Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, and then we'd add Austria or Netherlands or Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, and so forth. And I was sent over to coordinate things, and we talked about asking the same question in several languages and trying to equalize the alternatives from excellent, good, fair, poor, and so forth, so that the concepts were reasonably equivalent in different languages. That was a very useful experience.
And what was the content of those particular studies that you did?
Well, USIA was the idea of USIA was people to people when Eisenhower started it, and so we were trying to tell people about America, tell them America's story to the world is their motto. So we had a lot of questions on what we call the image of America, what they thought of Americans, American life, and whether they went to the exhibits that we put up or the libraries, and whether they listened to VOA. So we called ourselves the Ear of America.
The Ear of America?
EAR, the Ear of America, as while we were checking to see if the Voice of America had any audience. It did, surprisingly. It had quite a lot. We taught English over the radio, did a lot of useful things.
Is that where we got the name Voice of America?
The Voice of America had been started before USIA. I believe it was under the State Department. When USIA became independent, it took over the Voice and ran it until it's pretty much its demise a few years ago.
Did you do any work for the Voice of America? Any studies?
Yes, we did a lot of studies in trying to get the audience to a radio program which was aimed at places we couldn't reach. Was rather a challenge. We went to trade fairs and we'd get visitors from behind the Iron Curtain. We offered transistors for people who would write in. Did a lot of unorthodox things. Couldn't exactly go knocking on doors to ask if they listened, but we made some conclusions about where the listenership was good and where it wasn't, and I think it was helpful to the program.
And how was your research received?
By people in USIA?
Exactly.
And the government in general? I think very, very well. A lot of it, at least the policy part of it, the reports were originally classified. So they didn't have much of an audience outside of the international arm of the government. Later on, I might as well say it now, because when I went back to USIA in a second tour, what my big project was to get all these things declassified. I got them over to the National Archives, where they're now available to everybody who has the time and money to go to National Archives.
And we could probably see history repeating itself a little bit. So now, just in terms of a chronology, did you go back to Crossley Inc. at any time?
Yes and no. In 1954, let's see, I'm a little confused on the time series myself there. Crossley Inc. merged with the management, Stuart Dougal, and it became Crossley SD Surveys. And my dad stayed active in that. And for a while, I ran the Princeton office of Crossley SD, which was in charge of all the field department. Crossley Inc. had been known for about the best field service department, because in those days we did interviews by knocking on doors. They were face-to-face interviews. Although the radio ratings, in which my dad made his first reputation, were done by telephone. So things go around and they come around. And around 1960, you did go back to the government doing work in Korea around that? Yes. Well, what happened? I worked for USIA, for Leo, and the international barometer surveys that he set up from 1955 to 1960. And then in 1960, the end of 1960, I took a 2-year assignment to Korea, primarily to do a big evaluation survey of the whole training program that what is now AID. It was called USOM, U.S. Operations Missions, or something then. But it's become AID, and we were training Koreans in police work and factory work and so forth, and we sent them abroad, and we had, I think, 3 phases training. No, I'm not sure I remember. But it was a very interesting time. It was one of the coups, was after Syngman Rhee, and I remember I guess the first of the post-Rhee dictators came charging up from the Han River, firing a few shots, which went right through our offices, fortunately, before we got there. And then the new dictator decided that he was going to make Korea democratic. So he wanted to start some opinion polls. And Ralph Lewis, who was attached to the embassy there, and I was with USOM, both served as advisors to the 2 major Korean English language newspapers, and set up some sort of through the sociology departments of the universities. And actually I got a little commendation for that. It's kind of a pioneering experience. Then after we left, some more dictators came in, knocked all the polls out, and 10 years later somebody else had to start them all over again. Of course, now they're flourishing. But I do feel as if I had a little bit of a founding part in that. Absolutely do.
In terms of implementing research there, sort of government intervention, what were some of the practical challenges in Korea?
In Korea? Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think it was too bad, because the sociology professors were Western trained. They knew they could understand statistics. We had plenty of lists to use for sampling purposes. it really wasn't all that challenging, except for convincing people. Well, yes, you couldn't ask questions about the government regime, but you could ask questions about what they thought of the U.S. and how they were handling their household finances. I guess we could. I'm not sure that we did. So I'm sure it wasn't as difficult as in some other places where it was introduced and caught on pretty fast.
Skipping back a little in time and about AAPOR itself, you and your dad were both founding members of AAPOR. What were some of the key questions, do you remember, that were being discussed at the time in, I guess it was in Williamstown? Williamstown?
Well, let's go to the founding of the two. Harry Field, who was the head of NORC, had called a meeting in Central City, Colorado in 1946, as most everybody probably knows by now. And then he got himself killed in a plane accident. So that the follow-up to Central City, which was scheduled for Williamstown in September of 1947, there was no Harry Field. But the meeting at Central City sparked so much interest that a whole lot of people came to Williamstown and formally established AAPOR, and also set up an international committee which became WAPOR the following year in Pennsylvania. So that both of them really trace their origins to Williamstown in '47.
Right. And what was some of when everybody got together, what were the topics? Was it mostly about the founding of the organization? Was there content to discuss politically? Well, this was before the '48 election, so I guess you'd have to look up the program of the time. I remember going to one of the meetings where there was a very heated discussion about probability versus quota sampling, which went on and on for years. Most people have ended up with all kinds of compromises, but it was talked about in '47 in Williamstown. We briefly discussed this offline, but how would you compare AAPOR then and AAPOR now? Well, AAPOR was a budding organization of people with common interests. Was fairly small, 100 or so members, I think. And now it's way up 1,1600 people with common interests and much broader interests. It was governed rather informally with an amateurish sort of constitution, whereas now it's been completely reorganized with one of the best designed systems for selection and succession of officers that I've ever seen. And how about WAPOR? You were also one of the founding members of WAPOR. Well, I was actually more active in WAPOR than I was in AAPOR. I did serve on several AAPOR committees, and I served as secretary-treasurer for a term. But in WAPOR, which I first joined in '47, but in my tours in Germany and in USIA, in my association with Leo Crespi there, Leo was a president of WAPOR, and I guess got me into secretary-treasurer or something, and eventually I worked my way, for lack of other candidates or something, to the president. I think I was something like the 8th president of WAPOR, and I know I was the first female president. And most of the time that I was president of WAPOR, I was in Korea, so I wasn't very efficient. But I did have to go, I thought, to one of the annual meetings, which was held in Baden-Baden in Germany. And Ludwig Erhard was the chancellor at the time and sat at the table with me, which was very nice. And then at just about that time, the Berlin Wall went up. So my official days with WAPOR
I've continued. I'm sort of historian there now, but I'm not doing very much. We did establish an archive at University of North Carolina.
And speaking of archiving, I understand you're pretty busy archiving your father's papers. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the University of Connecticut has set up, through the instigation of Chris Dodd and the state of Connecticut, which provided some funds, the Dodd Research Center, and they have an archive of survey research pioneers. So my dad's papers are more than half, maybe 2/3 of them are up there already, and I'm trying to get the rest of them ready to go. They already have Elmo Roper's and Sam Lubell's, and they have. What I've been doing is going through the 5 cabinets of stuff that my father left and trying to get it in a certain shape so that people who are interested in the history of market and political research can find it. It'll be all carefully indexed and I believe eventually made available on the web.
Terrific. Which leads us to a nice segue about Archibald Crossley. AAPOR knows your father, Archibald Crossley, as a founder of modern public opinion polling, but he was also a pioneer in market and advertising research, as well as the Crossley ratings or TV and radio ratings. So on that point, let's first start with, how did your father become involved in doing research for politics?
Well, let's start at the beginning. Okay. He went to Princeton with a class of 1917, but he didn't finish until he got his degree in 1950, after all 3 of his children had gotten through Ivy League schools. So I don't know quite why he didn't finish his senior year, and I'm not quite sure what he did with the next year or 2, except court my mother. But his first job was with the J.H. Cross advertising agency in Philadelphia, and he was hired to do research. And he said, what's research? And his boss said, well, I don't know, you figure it out. So he did, and he started doing research on ads. And he was there a couple of years, and then he went on to the Literary Digest, which at the time was running these million-vote polls based on automobile owners and so forth, and coming out, lucky enough to come out. Well, George Gallup in 1936 said the Literary Digest was going to be very wrong in predicting Mr. Landon. Dad got interested in this, and he sold his services to King Features, Hearst Papers, and Elmo Roper, who was working for Fortune magazine, got in, and in 1936 they knocked the Literary Digest poll right out of history. In the meantime, Dad had gone into radio ratings, and this was done by, as I indicated earlier, was done by telephone. And these Crossley ratings were known for a long time for sponsored radio programs as the measure of success. That was carried on. He invented them in 1928 and 29, and in 1930 he got the Bach Prize from Harvard for the invention of radio ratings. And he kept it up through a group called the Cooperative Analysis of Broadcasting, CAB, until about 1946. Meanwhile, I think Hooper had come into the business, and TV was coming up, and more investment and so forth, and so he sort of got out of the radio rating business at that point, and he never went into TV ratings.
Do you know how the audience metrics changed over time from when your dad first did it to, I think, a little when Hooper came in, and then maybe A.C. Nielsen?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that.
The audience measurement. How was the audience measured? It was slightly different from your dad's rating to the way it is.
Well, that gets sort of technical. I don't know how much time you want to put on that. There were as I say, they were made by telephone, and there is a day part method where you ask what you've been listening to in the last quarter hour or 2 hours or whatever. And there's also the coincidental where you ask, what are you listening to now? So there was a certain amount of controversy on that.
Right.
Then there was controversy about what to sample. For a long while, telephones and radios were held by approximately the same numbers, kinds of people, so that you could get a pretty accurate rating on that. So I don't know. Then the other thing was that my dad experimented with, but didn't really follow through on for primarily financial reasons, was a little instrument that you put in the radio that told when it was on and what station it was tuned to. And Nielsen, well, I don't know whether Hooper used that or not. He was a competitor, but Nielsen picked that up. He had lots of money from other indexes he was doing, and put them into TV sets, and so then it became Nielsen ratings for TV.
I think you had said that your father started his own company in 1926, on or about 1926.
Mm-hmm.
What prompted him to start his own company?
Well, as I said, he was working for the Literary Digest, doing research for their advertisers, I guess, and somehow or other decided that he'd do something on his own, and so he had some contact with Shredded Wheat, who became his first independent client. So having done that and decided he liked being on his own, he founded Crossley Inc. in February of 1926.
You just mentioned Shredded Wheat. Who were some of his other key clients?
Well, as he went on, of course, there were the radio, which started a couple of years after that, and they were advertisers and networks who bought into that service. And then in the late 30s, he started magazine and media research, set up a magazine audience group of some pretty distinguished figures in the media publishing field. And Life picked it up, ran a continuing study of magazine audiences. Then he also did a lot of work for Look. He did a lot of work for WOR, having to do primarily with the audiences and their behavior and what they used and bought and so forth, what they thought of the ads and the articles in the media.
Was it more editorial content, or was it advertising?
It was more advertising and consumer behavior, but there was some editorial content. He did one study for Esquire magazine, which very few people now remember, had a series of what they called Varga girls, and they had calendars and various things like that. I guess you'd call that editorial research.
Could you go into a little bit more detail on what the continuous consumer index was?
Not too much, because I'm still getting to that for the archives, but I guess it may have been an early version of what they now call tracking studies. The idea was to interview continuously on behalf of the sponsors of a whole lot of different products and brands, and see what the usage patterns were, and also the media patterns, how they changed with what they read and so forth. There was a lot of stuff. I'm not quite sure just how long it lasted, but it was a multi-subscriber, multi-product kind of thing.
And what was this Corbett study?
Oh, you've heard of that. Well, that was just one of the many innovations. My dad was quite a innovator, and a man of a lot of ideas, loved to be challenged by how do I find this out and so forth. And somewhere along the line, somebody thought that it would be a good idea to find out what kind of products households used by collecting all their boxes and cans and things. So he went around with, before the days of plastic bags, he must have used paper bags, and from selected sample of people, he collected all this and tabulated it by hand. Now you've got these barcodes that tell you absolutely everything, but this was preliminary way of getting at the same information, and it was original, and he did get a prize for it.
Terrific. He was also, was he active in the Market Research Council at that time too?
He was very active in Market Research Council, which was one of his most appreciated audience groups, and American Marketing Association. He was primarily in commercial research for most of his career. He got into polling in '36, I think primarily as a way to get his name known. He'd already begun to be known as for the radio ratings, and he knew the value of publicity, and he was fascinated by the challenge. So he got into polling, and he did polling in '36. 48 was going to be his last one, but with that disaster, he decided he had to do it again in 52, which he did. And then after that, all he did was local polls for various newspapers and so forth. And he never really had a syndicated public opinion service like AAPO, like Gallup's poll at all. But he did quite a lot of work for local areas on issues of the day for them. And later on, he got into work for political candidates, and he did quite a bit of work for Nelson Rockefeller.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, he had retired. Well, let me see. The Political Surveys and Analysis was a group, an organization that he set up so that he could be a consultant and not have to run the field operations anymore. They contracted out the field work. And it was called PSA, and Nelson Rockefeller's trusted aide in public opinion, Lloyd Free, who had been a partner of Hadley Cantrell's, came and worked with us, and he did quite a bit for Rockefeller while he was governor, and including a study on the New York State Lottery as to why they weren't selling more lottery tickets. Well, it wasn't too hard to figure that out because the tickets were being sold mostly in banks where people didn't take their money out and immediately put it on the lottery. They were people who thought carefully about money. So the recommendation was to start selling lottery tickets in drugstores and other places, and the lottery sales went way up. So that I think, endeared him to the Rockefeller administration, and he stuck with Rocky while he was running for president in '64 and '68, got involved in the polling there. He did some other studies for the state, too.
I think, was it before that, could you tell us about his work about Lyndon Johnson?
The Lyndon Johnson thing turned out to be one of the things that he ended up being proudest of. It cost him a lot of worry. What happened was that at the time that he was looking around for other clients than Rockefeller, he didn't want to be known just as a Rockefeller pollster. This was '67, I think. And a New Yorker who was, I guess, a backer of Johnson, asked that a poll be done in 3 counties. They called it a bellwether county. Well, this was to be done, it was to be confidential for private client, and as long as it was done well and honestly, this was fine. But the sponsor who paid the money for it sent it to Lyndon Johnson as a bellwether county. Well, it was Stafford County of New Hampshire, and it isn't a bellwether county. It's one that is usually more Democratic than the others. And Johnson was so pleased to see that his figures were looking pretty good that he called in the press and showed them the poll. And of course, this was not an indication that Johnson was doing very well, and so my dad was very upset about this, worried for a week or 10 days what he could do. Finally, he called in Robert Johnson, I think, of Southern California, and had him write the whole story, and it got plastered all over the papers about how LBJ was spouting these figures to show how well he was doing when he really wasn't. And as a result, this came to the attention of AAPOR, and eventually a clause got into the AAPOR Constitution that requires researchers to go public whenever their private clients misuse their figures to mislead the public. And I think Dad was particularly proud of having contributed to that.
Not a problem unique to that time, but some of us don't encounter that today. Toward the end of his career, your dad set up, I think, a PSA to study conflict resolution.
The conflict resolution was not PSA. He got particularly interested towards the end of his, when he had time to sit back and relax, and he was half retired. He got very upset about the various ethnic racial conflicts around the world, and he thought that public opinion polling could play some role in letting people see the other people as they were being seen. And so he collaborated with Princeton University, I think the Woodrow Wilson School, to set up a 2-day seminar where people came from half a dozen or more places where such conflicts existed, in Spain with the Basques, in India, Ireland, I think. I forget the others. They ended up in a book that I'd like to promote called, I can't give you the exact title, Resolving Nationality Conflicts, I think it is, the role of public opinion research. It's published by Prager, and it's practically out of print. But I think it was quite useful because it did throw light on the two sides in many of these conflicts. And that got him interested in what role public opinion polling could play. And so when the Falklands got taken over by Argentina, he drummed up some money from his 1917 classmates, and I think he was in his 80s at this point, and set up a little pilot test of an actual situation down there that just ended in just an article in a magazine. But it was typical of what he hoped that public opinion could do, and I think he would hope that more of it would be done than is done now.
Of all your dad's accomplishments, which spans his entire career, how do you think he would want to be remembered?
Well, he was remembered, I think, for his integrity, honesty, his loyalty to clients. I think he'd particularly want to be remembered for the contribution that Lyndon Johnson helped him make. That's pretty much it, I think.
And do you want to say something about your family?
Well, he married a gal a couple of years older than himself who graduated from Radcliffe and was very great help to him, although she never did very much work in the office. Most of it was done at home. They had three kids, me, I'm the oldest, my brother, who was electronic technician, and my younger sister, who was a photographer. So we're pretty varied. He had 3 grandchildren, and eventually, although he didn't live to see them all, 8 great-grandchildren.
Wonderful. And now to bring a full circle of all of your accomplishments, which ones are you most proud of, or which one are you most proud of?
Well, I think that that has to be the USIA operation, because I think in the early stages we did help. We played a big role in the Cold War, and also in the developing countries. The whole people-to-people idea was helped by the surveys that we did. And in the end, in my final tour, when I got so much of the classified information, managed to get it declassified, which is a nasty bureaucratic process, and got it all over to National Archives for people to read. I think I'm proud of that, and also of working with AAPOR and the international researchers that I was privileged to meet.
Is there any message that you would like to say to the people, to the younger people in AAPOR, who might be starting out a career? Any advice?
Well, they're having a harder time than we had, I think. What with telephone, telemarketers, do not calls, refusal rates. Hang in there. It's a worthwhile career, and let's hope it can move forward.
Well, I hope we could all fulfill the example that you and your dad created for us. Thank you so much.